My name is Larry Jackson and welcome to the J4BG Family Parenting Seminars. Today we're going to talk about value-based parenting, a way to help your child change their outcomes from the inside out. What is value-based parenting? Value-based parenting is a simplified way to help track your child's challenges and improvements over time. It's also a tool to help persuade your child to be the best person they can be. It's also a unique way to create an agreed upon value improvements between you and your child. This model here represents what I call the circle of influence. The circle of influence represents how we can help best influence our children by first dealing with core areas. The first core area is the relationship, or what I like to call family leadership. The relationship is simply this: is you establishing a relationship with your child that says, I care about you. Because I care about you, I have high expectations of you. Because I have high expectations of you, I'm going to be tough on you. And I'm going to be a little bit tough on you because I have high expectations of you, or because I care about you. And creating that circular model will allow you to be able to say the tough things sometimes, but also put your child in a position where they're more willing to respond to the request. The second circle within this ecosystem is value-based parenting, or what is the discipline structure. The key to this is teaching self-discipline. In other words, how do we teach our child how to self-regulate? It is more important for our children to self-regulate than to have external regulations imposed upon them. And that's a key element to my model. The last thing here we have is behavior. And so I want to backtrack a little bit here. When I'm working with the family, usually what they would like me to do is to deal strictly with behavior, address the behavior issue head on, and find out what's going on. And I say yes and no to that. I want to understand, I want to deal with behavior, but I want to deal with it in relation to the relationship within the family, and also what is the discipline structure, and how can we adjust that so that when a child misbehaves, the boundaries that we've defined as far as a relationship and how we want them to self-regulate themselves is clear. So a general rule of thumb when we're doing this model is this. We want, if a child is unable to complete a task, what we want to do is we want to break that task down into simple steps. And we want to make it as easy as possible. This model represents, or it symbolizes that the easier the task, and thus we want to make it as easy as possible, we want to offer a sharp consequence for it. And what it ends up happening is we end up putting our child in a position where they're more apt to respond to our direct approach when we have to deal with behavior. And so this model, the goal of this model, of this approach here is to set the parental requirement, make the parental requirements as simple as possible so that we can uncover or address the behavior causes. Key approaches to this model is in the persuasion process. In other words, how do I persuade my child that the behavior issues that they're displaying are things that need to be corrected? The first thing I want to talk about is persuading versus teaching values. Teaching is important, and teaching values is important, but it is more important to put the child in a position where they're teaching themselves those values rather than to outright call them out and make them accountable based on what I say. And so My theory is that we can effectively persuade our children to develop a value system from their perspective, in their own words, or if we can effectively persuade our children to develop a value system from their perspective, they'll not only take ownership of the action, but they'll adjust their behavior at a faster pace. The other approach that I have to this model is we're helping our child develop inner conscience. That inner voice is so important. And so what I want to do is I want to persuade my child to identify what issues that they have themselves. I want their own voice to talk to themselves about their own behavior. My theory is that if I can get a child to talk to themselves and to process and to deal with themselves about their own behavior, that they're more apt to take ownership of it. In other words, if I give them the control, oftentimes we as parents, we want to distribute all this authority and control, but we forget to allow the child to develop that self-awareness on their own. So we want a child to be curious and engaged about their own behavior on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. The key questions that you want to ask during this process, when you're going through this process with your child, is how does your child view their own behavior? In other words, hold the mirror up and say, okay, what do you see you want to improve on? Well, most parents will say, well, what if they don't say what I think is wrong? That's okay. If you start to where they want to improve at, they will eventually see that they will eventually see the other behaviors that might be destructive in their lives. And so we don't want to discount the child by adding our input right off the bat just because they can't see something initially. What we want to do is we want to start the process of self-reflection and self-analysis. Once we do that, the other stuff will take care of itself. But we want to get a child into the motion of assessing their own behavior and finding out solutions as to how they can overcome those behavioral challenges. The other question that you want is, what do you want to improve on? So again, we're talking about behavior here. How does your child view their own behavior, and what do they want to improve on? They're the same questions, but they're different questions. How do your child view your own behavior addresses what do you see as problematic in your life. And what do you want to improve on is the same question, but asked in a different way that says, okay, well, although this might be problematic, what are some areas that you also want to grow on? So we're asking the same question, but again, these are key questions here that we want to throw out at our child in different ways to get them to process and to think outside the box about their behavior. The value-based parenting game plan. This is a 5-step process with intentional and redundancy. So the first step is we identify behavioral challenges. The second step is we set values to those behaviors. In step 3, we set proactive discipline towards the behaviors that we're having a hard time improving on. We set proactive discipline to those behaviors or to those values to reinforce those values. And then step 4 is refine it if they're incapable of doing the proactive discipline step. So, and then step 5, we set a behavioral recovery plan. And I want to reiterate that setting a behavioral recovery plan, we're dealing with consequences. In other words, how do we help you get back? What if something happens, then there's got to be a plan in place to help get you back on track. So it looks a little bit like consequences or discipline, but we want to label consequence and discipline differently, so that our child understands that our intent is to help them recover and not to punish them. That is key there. Our intent, when we provide discipline, or when we punish when we discipline our child, the intent is to help them recover and to get back on track and not to punish them. Once they see that come from us, they're more apt to self-regulate based on that pattern. So we're going to go through step 1 here. Identify my child's behavioral challenges. This activity, what we want you to do right now is using positive statements, create a list of areas your child can improve on. So what you want to do is you want to create a list. You want to cognitively guide yourself through a list of things that your child can improve on. Then you want to hold that list off to the side, and you want to sit down with your child, and you want them to come up with things that they think they can improve on. Now we're going to hold that other list that you created by yourself in hiatus, and we're going to use it to help provide hints for the child as to how they can improve what they're missing on their list. But we want the child to come up with their own list as to how they can improve their own behavior. Again, the reason why we do this is because once they identify that they have problems outside of external voices, they can then hold themselves accountable to improving that behavior. They take ownership of it. In other words, you are in control of your own behavior. And this is how we're doing it. We're going to have you identify what you think is wrong. All right? Leading up to our values here, I want to take a tangent to talk about Benjamin Franklin. Our model is sort of based off of Benjamin Franklin's 13 virtues. Benjamin Franklin in 1726 created this system to help develop his character, and he listed 13 virtues that he tracked on a weekly basis. And that's what we're essentially doing. We're not exactly tracking 13 virtues, but we're tracking values that we're tracking values on a weekly basis as it relates to present behavior, and we're doing that because I believe that if you can assess yourself on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, you're more apt to become a better person, not just at home but at school. Step 2. So once we've created a list of behaviors, we're going to create a value. We're going to identify some values that we can attach to those behaviors. So for this activity, we're going to set up a value system so that your child takes ownership of their behavior. What we want to do is we want to tell your child, okay, what are your behaviors? Let's look at what you say are your behaviors, and how can these behaviors be summed up in one value, in one area that we can improve on, because we're going to take this value and we are going to work on it so that we can help improve these areas here. So I'm not concerned about working on the behavior here. What I'm concerned about is working on the value, and then from the value they'll be able to self-regulate and address their behavior piece by piece. And again, in comparison to a normal parenting style, the normal parenting style is I'll deal with the behavior and then there'll be a consequence that's attached to the behavior. We don't want that. What we're going to do is we're going to identify the behaviors, and then we're going to identify the values associated with those behaviors, and then we're going to set proactive steps to help improve the value system. Once that doesn't take place, then we're going to help them recover by putting in some other self-discipline activities. So I want to be keen here on it. We're not emphasizing on the behavior necessarily as much as we are the value that we want them to display. And what this does is hopefully it encourages the parent to talk with the child based on who they want them to be, not only today, but down the road. And we want to put their future in the present as parents. We want to say, you know what, you identify some things that you want to be, I want to help you be the best person you can be, so that you can be this awesome adult. So there's, the intent is not only will it help the child process how they view their own behavior, but it'll also help the parent process what type of child they want them, what type of person they want their child to strive to be. And that is key. That is key there in the persuasion process. So the next step here, before we talk about proactive activities, we're going to talk about proactive versus reactive parenting. Now, we all know that parenting is an art form. However, there are certain things that should be followed, and there's certain things we should probably put on the back burner and look at a little bit more. We're going to talk about two concepts here, proactive and reactive parenting. Let's deal with reactive first. Reactive is the spur-of-the-moment reactions that you have to your child when they misbehave. You know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you pat them on the butt, or it's that knee-jerk reaction without thinking, disciplined response to when your child behaves. It is sporadic, and most importantly, it is emotional. And I tell parents, and I'll tell you, that you have to take your emotion out of the parenting process, because you don't want a child